Good afternoon, everybody, and to those that are joining online, good day, whatever time zone you are joining us from. It is my distinct honor today to introduce our speaker, who is going to be the distinguished speaker in global development. A little bit about the distinguished speaker series, because it's a little bit of a departure from our normal everyday seminar series. This was established 3 years ago. There's a committee, it consists of myself, Surab Mehta, Terry Tucker, Louise, that seeks to select speakers who have had a distinguished career in the 3 thematic areas for global development. These thematic areas include well-being and inclusion, environmental sustainability, food and nutritional security. And we could not think of somebody who embodies these 3 thematic areas more than the person that I'm going to be introducing to you today. So our distinguished speaker in global development for 2023 is Dr. Shakuntala Haraksingh Thilsted. She's a native of Trinidad and Tobago and a citizen of Denmark. She's currently the Director of Nutrition, Health, and Food Security Impact Area under the new One CGIAR group. She received the 2021 World Food Prize for a groundbreaking research, critical insights, landmark innovations, and in developing holistic, nutrition-sensitive approaches to aquaculture and food systems. For those who don't know about the World Food Prize, this is, for people who work in this area, the highest accolade that one can receive, similar kind of to the Nobel Prize for this working space. By bringing together interdisciplinary and international collaborators, she drove transformation in aquatic food systems to deliver improved nutrition, resilient ecosystems, and secure livelihoods for millions of vulnerable people across the globe. Prior to joining World Fish in 2010, she worked as an associate professor in the human nutrition departments of the University of Copenhagen and the Royal Veterinary and Agricultural University in Denmark. She has more than 25 years experience in research and has published excellent pieces in many peer-reviewed outlets on food and nutritional security in low-income countries. Shakuntala holds a PhD from the Royal Veterinary and Agricultural University in Denmark. Please help me welcome our distinguished speaker in global development.
Thank you, Ed, for your kind introduction. And thank you all for coming to the lecture today in person. It's really nice to be in a room again, facing live people. My topic that I've chosen to talk on is transforming food systems, aquatic foods for nourishing people and planet. And it's going to be more so on people because that's where I work than on the planet. I'll make a few remarks on that. I'll begin by giving an overview of food and nutrition security globally, because that's the area in which we are hoping to make an impact, and then talk about the global agenda in terms of the sustainable development goals as to how aquatic foods can play a role within this global narrative, and then move on to describing aquatic foods, why I, like so many others, don't use fish, but aquatic foods, and the benefits, the multiple benefits of aquatic foods, talk about the research and the agenda with putting aquatic foods on the published literature that we have done recently, and move on to give specific brief examples of 5 approaches, nutrition-sensitive approaches, and conclude with 3 calls to action. So if we look at the global food and nutrition security, and these are data that we all have access to from the state of food security and nutrition in the world, we can see that in Africa, Asia and the Pacific, there's a large prevalence of people who face hunger. And if we look at the latest data with respect to when COVID-19 started, we can see that COVID-19 has added very many more people to those who are hungry and malnourished. It's still very worrisome of the rates of malnutrition we have globally. More than 1 in every 5 children is stunted, meaning too short for their age. And even more worrisome is the growing rates of overweight in children. And this is happening across the globe. If we look at the trends, and we started in 2000, these graphs starts from 2005 and goes on to 2021. We can see that we were making really good progress globally until the middle of up to 2015, 2016. And we were all very eager to reaching the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. But with the disruptions caused by COVID, increasing disruptions of climate change, disruptions of war and conflicts, and then lots of people on the move, a great many people migrating, we can see that the rates of hunger and malnutrition have started increasing in the last few years. And this is extremely worrisome when we've all set our eyes towards the targets of 2030, just 7 years from now. And prognosis tells us that we will not be able to meet the projections that we set off for ourselves, and that the data is showing that up to 700 million people will still be facing hunger in 2030. And we have the goal of zero hunger, zero malnutrition to 2030, leaving no one behind. So focus on the poor and vulnerable. And now what we are seeing is that the ranks of the poor and vulnerable are increasing. So this is extremely worrisome. Moving to aquatic foods. Aquatic foods hasn't been on the global narrative. But we do know, if we look at the data and the work that I have done with colleagues across the globe, we can see that aquatic food systems have the potential to contribute to all 3 pillars of sustainable development: socially, the economic, and the environment. So as an entry point to transformation of food systems, aquatic foods must not be left behind. If we look at the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that aquatic food systems contribute to many of the SDGs. And the one that I focus on is zero hunger and zero malnutrition, but it contributes in high regard, it also contributes to SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 3, good health and well-being. Gender equality is extremely important because there are many women, especially in low and middle-income countries, who are engaged in aquatic food systems. SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. And of course, it relates to SDG 14, life below water. So there's a lot of focus on life below water. No, still not much on food in waters. And of course, climate change. This is about the only slide I have talking about the environments, because my focus was on people and nourishing people. But if you look at the conversion efficiency of feed, and you compare aquaculture and fisheries with cattle, pig, and chicken, you can see that the efficiency rates are much better for the amount of food you need to put into the animal, to the amount of meat that you get out from the animals. So these are much more efficient systems of production. And if you look at the greenhouse gas emissions, and again, compare with other animal source foods, such as beef and pork, you can see also that fisheries and aquaculture fare much better with respect to emissions. I want to talk a little bit about the global agenda and the global narrative. So, of course, this has started a long time, but if I would begin with the UN Decade of Action in Nutrition, and then move across to where we are today and where we are going forward with the COPs that we hold every year. Of course, within the Decade of Action in Nutrition, there has been a lot of focus on food, but not on aquatic foods, on land-based foods. And then now, with global agendas and conferences that have started with the oceans, the Ocean Conference that was held in Lisbon last year, and the United Nations Decade of Ocean from 2021 to 2030. We remark that the word that's used is ocean, it's not waters. So there's a focus on the oceans and not also on inland waters, which is quite a setback if we just think about the Great Lakes of Africa. And within these different global narrative, there's a lot about the richness and the economies that can benefit from the oceans to nations, and mainly to wealthy nations. And the focus on foods from inland waters and marine waters is quite sparse. So this is something that those I work with, we are trying to do something about, especially in the COPs every year, and ensuring that there's an integration of food systems within climate change and an integration also within food, land, and water systems. What are aquatic foods? And I was talking with a group this morning, and I was saying that at the global level, we started using the term aquatic foods only in the middle of 2019. The term that was used before that would be fish, and not recognizing the diversity of aquatic foods. At parts of the year, if you go to a country, Laos, where I work, then fish would not be the most commonly consumed aquatic food. There will be many other types of aquatic foods that make a part of the diet. And there are thousands and thousands of animals, plants, and microorganisms that are both farmed and collected from all waters, both from inland waters and the oceans. And these make up the richness and the diversity of aquatic foods. And I do not know how. Well, first of all, we have to collect the data. We have to go out and talk to communities and get the information from communities. What do aquatic foods mean for them in terms of parts of their diets? And only then would we have the data of the richness and diversity and seasonality of aquatic foods. And we know from our data that there are over 3 billion people who consume aquatic foods as part of their everyday diets, and that many people, many millions of people, especially women, depend on aquatic food systems for their livelihoods and income. The data is sparse, and many times the data are incorrect. In the world, so this was another catchphrase that I started with, and only started with, as I said, in 2020, where I and the people I work with, I said, let's try to get a tagline aquatic foods. You know, if you would see the word Coca-Cola, you would recognize it. So when you see aquatic foods, I want people to recognize it, and also to recognize that they are aquatic, that they are superfoods, and superfoods for the multiple benefits that we get from diverse aquatic foods. The first that I work with is, of course, the food and nutrition benefits. And if you notice, I pay attention to micronutrients and essential fatty acids, which are extremely important for growth, development, cognition in children. I do not even mention protein, because there's this misconception that aquatic foods are fish and fish is a source of protein. But that's not where it starts or ends when we look at the benefits of multiple aquatic foods. So many aquatic foods are rich in essential micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. And many aquatic foods are great sources of essential fatty acids, extremely important for cognitive development in young children. And we do know, if you would travel along as I said, the Great Lakes of Africa, if you would go to communities in the Pacific and to the Caribbean, where I come from, you would see the benefits in terms of livelihoods and income, and the engagement of women in aquatic food systems. And I've mentioned the environmental benefits before. I've worked a lot with looking at micronutrients contribution from aquatic food systems. And since, as I said before, aquatic foods are extremely varied, and they are animals, plants, microorganisms, then if you look at the different groups of aquatic foods, the contribution to the recommended intakes of micronutrients, of course, vary. The darker shades show you with 100 grams of edible parts, what's the contribution to recommended intakes of different types of micronutrients and essential fatty acids. DHA and EPA are essential fatty acids. So you would see there's a variation in the different groups of aquatic foods. But if you go back and look at consumption patterns, Asia, Africa, you would see that much of the aquatic foods that are consumed belong to low trophic species, and that many of these species, for example, small indigenous fish species, they are rich in multiple micronutrients and rich in essential fatty acids. One of the micronutrients that many people are looking at is vitamin B12, because of the importance, again, of vitamin B12, the cognition in children. So the global narrative has to change. And I think a good way of changing it is moving from the word feeding to nourishing, because that gives us a total different perspective. In the past, with the Green Revolution, when we used feeding, and very applicable, people, large population groups were dying of stark hunger. That's not where we are today in the world. And it's not so much about the quantity of the food that we eat, but it's both quantity as well as quality. And quality is just not nutritional quality, where I started working, but I had many colleagues who then reminded me, Shakuntala, equally important is food safety. So when we talk about the quality of food, it's just not the delivery of certain micronutrients and other nutrients, but it's also food safety, which can impact health in very grave ways, as we know, in children. So it's important to change the narrative, change the words, the language that we use. It's equally important that when we look at food systems and aquatic foods, that we look at all parts of the food systems. From the 60s until now, we start with production and the inputs to production. By the time we reach the consumers, everyone has left or has fallen asleep. So I have worked with changing the order of things. Let's begin with consumption and work our way back to supplies and production. And not just linearly, but look at the multiple entry points throughout the whole food systems, also policies, for example. And in doing so, that means we must engage all actors throughout the food systems. And consumers are extremely important. And within the group that we work with consumers, youth are extremely important because they can shape the future behaviors and the consumption that would then drive the supply chains and drive the production systems. Just from 2021 to now, we have worked with groups and two important, a set of papers came out of the Blue Foods Assessment. The Blue Foods Assessment was led by Stanford University and Stockholm Resilience Center, and we worked closely about 100 researchers over the course of 2 to 3 years. And if you would look in Nature, you would see there's a series of papers on aquatic foods in Nature. What I think is extremely important is the UN nutrition paper on aquatic foods. This was published in 2021. And why do I say this is important? One, well, the quality of the paper is really good. Two, it has a focus only on aquatic foods. And it's endorsed by the UN organizations that are part of the United Nations and by the member states that support the UN nutrition. So if you would look it up, you would see this paper. It was extremely difficult to get the UN to agree that there should be one paper on aquatic foods and not just paper on the range of animal source foods. So first, the UN had to be convinced that aquatic foods are more than just animal source foods. What's important in this paper is that it provides recommendations for how nations can include aquatic foods to improve food and nutrition security and how it can be embedded in policies at the national level. So I would suggest if you're interested, please look for this UN nutrition paper. So the change that has happened in these last few years has been that we start with people, putting people at the center and beginning with consumers. How do we meet the nutritional needs of all, leaving no one behind? That's part of the right to food. And it's extremely important that we always remember that it should live up to the rights of food, leaving no one behind, and that we should use multiple entry points to reach to this transformation of food systems. In doing so, diversity is fundamental. Fundamental, diversity of people, diversity of systems, diversity of the foods that we eat. I would give, through the work that I've been doing with colleagues across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, I would give 5 examples as to how we've been working with this. Starting with consumption. So we've looked at ways to diversify consumption with aquatic foods. And in doing so, we've worked with communities to develop from traditional knowledge and traditional recipes, different types of food-based products that can be added to diets. In Africa and Asia, we've worked with dried small fish. If you would go to Lake Malawi and look at the fish that comes out of Lake Malawi and that poor people eat, it's the small fish that's dried. In Asia, we've used this small fish to make fish powder, which is then added to the complementary foods of young children. A fish chutney which is the same as, for example, a mango chutney that's used in Asia, and replace the mango with fish, and which is used for pregnant and lactating women as part of as a condiment on their main plate of food. And in Cambodia, to the right, the wafers that you see there are being used by the government of Cambodia and UNICEF in programs for malnourished children. What's good about these different products that can be made from aquatic foods is that it improves the usage, the convenience of usage. Drying the product means that you increase shelf life. And also, if you would make the products in the season of plenty, then it's also a cheaper product. So it also improves on affordability. What I began working with in Asia and now have moved to Africa and also to Timor-Leste in the Pacific is diversity of production systems. So in Bangladesh and in India, we've worked with homestead ponds. In Bangladesh, there are over 4 million homestead ponds. So there's a lot of space in which to do production of aquatic foods. And in India, each village has a Gram Panchayat tank, they call it. That's a village pond, which can be used for production. And in many parts of the world, you have a season that, you have the floods, you have the seasons of rains, where you have large masses of land underwater, wetlands, which can be used for production systems. So both in Africa and in Asia, we've looked at systems that are integrated with aquatic foods, with rice, and with vegetables. And in the supply chains, I would really like if in the African countries, we can move faster with solar drying of tents, both at household level, but even more so at community level. And in Solomon Islands, in the Pacific, there's a small project where solar-powered freezers are being used for fish that's caught from the sea. Again, when we talk from the past, where the systems just, as I say, begin with production and the inputs to production, that's very limited if we want to transform food systems. We must work at multiple entry points. And an extremely important entry point is policies. And if I would give 2 examples of policies, in Bangladesh, in the Second Country Investment Plan, which was termed nutrition-sensitive food systems, pond polyculture in Bangladesh was identified as one of the foremost entry points for nutrition-sensitive food systems, which means that the government and donor agencies were investing in pond polyculture. If I go to the state of Odisha, the strategy for Odisha's pathway to accelerated nutrition, with the work that's been done on aquatic food in Odisha, Odisha has included aquatic foods, small fish, dried small fish, in the school feeding programs, in take-home rations for women and children, and using it as part of the meals that are served to young children in healthcare centers. So if we would begin with policies, we can reach very far, we can reach very many, and we can move fast. I would really like to see more countries including aquatic foods within school feeding programs. I think that will be an extremely important avenue, pathway to reach many, and also with sustained effect on development, on national development for this generation and for future generations. I mentioned before that women play an extremely important role in aquatic food systems. However, that we don't even have the data for how many women are engaged. Because when officers go out to collect data, they talk to men. They do not talk to women. And it's difficult to get the data. And if you would go out in the middle of the day, women have already been out in the fields from 5 o'clock in the morning. They have already done their work. They are maybe now cooking. They do not want to be disturbed about somebody asking them about what were they doing. So it's extremely difficult to get data. So the contribution of women in aquatic food systems, as it is throughout all food systems, undervalued, unpaid, and overlooked. And we must do something about this. And a good place to begin is ensuring that we have reliable and sound data. And we can do this at multiple entry points in the food systems. We can look at the policy interventions, investments in research, data technologies. We know that women are lagging behind men with respect to the use of data technology. So this is one area we can push forward. And capacity building is extremely important. And how you use capacity building. You work with women in villages and they will tell you, well, if you want to teach us about food systems, do not put us in an integrated group with men and women. We would like to have our own groups where we can discuss our own issues and work together and find solutions that are suitable for us. So it's extremely important about the approaches that are used. Youth. If you look at in any country of the world, those who are engaged in food and nutrition, engaged in agriculture, they belong to the older generations. And we do know that food is important for this generation and for all coming generations. And therefore, we have to have others, younger people, engaged. And so I'm very happy to see all these young people in the audience today, and hope that some of you will take on this agenda. So it's extremely important we find ways to bring in youth within aquatic food systems in general, but also aquatic food systems. And it has to be done differently. To attract youth, it has to be done differently. There are areas that must be in focus. Their rights, equity, especially when you talk about young women, agency and recognition. I work in the high-level panel of experts at the Committee of World Food Security, and we put out a report on youth in agriculture, engagement of youth in agriculture and food systems in 2021. So if you want to see some of the recommendations that are there specifically for youth and how youth can be engaged in the food systems, please look at this report. When I worked within the UN Food Systems Summit 2021, we ensured that in all 5 of the action tracks, there was a youth co-chair taking part in all 5 action tracks. So there is space to be engaged and space to have your voice heard and to have influence. So in conclusion, I want to leave you with 3 areas, action areas. First, the recognition of the crucial role that aquatic foods play in transformation of food systems. And when we talk about food systems, it's being sustainable, nutritious, and importantly, equitable, leaving no one behind. Investments are extremely important in terms of research and innovations, and also investments for scale at all levels. And it is important that we have champions, and that these champions are empowered with capacity building, knowledge sharing, bridging the digital divide that we see between men and women, and using all these towards transforming food systems with aquatic foods. So there's a lot of space for young scientists, for young academics, and for students to engage in transformation of food systems. Cornell University is doing a lot. So I do hope we can set up some collaboration between Cornell University, stronger collaboration between Cornell University and where I work, the CGIAR, because the vision and mission of the CGIAR and its new strategy is transforming food, land, and water systems in a climate crisis. So there's enough room for all of us to have some contribution and to ensure that we move forward with transformation of food systems in a way that's equitable, leaving no one behind. If I would leave you with the tagline, holistic transformation of food, land, and water systems for nourishing people and planet must include aquatic foods. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thilsted. We now have about 10 to 12 minutes for Q&A and discussion. If you can raise your hand, introduce yourself and make your question very brief. I want to get to as many people as possible. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Nick Grandstaff. I'm a PhD student in applied economics over in Dyson, and I study food security stuff.
Speak a bit louder, please.
Okay, I'll do my best. Is it on? If not on,
No.
You have to get it really close to your mouth. That doesn't pick up very well.
Got it. Nick Grandstaff. I do applied economics and food security research over there. My question today, as we're looking at the protein transition in the world and aquatic foods position within this grander transformation, do you see an expansion of aquatic foods in this transition through intensification of existing aquatic food systems? So for example, like in farm ponds, making them more productive, or an expansion in locations of where aquatic food systems are used? Because on one side, there would have to be a lot more market development of getting foods from places where it's currently being produced, so like Bangladesh, etc., to places that it not traditionally has been. And on the other side, you'd really have to do a lot of legwork in a place that hasn't previously done aquatic food systems to set up farm ponds in a different location. As a person who sees it from like the top down,
Yes.
Which way do you think, or what share, because I know it's not a black and white thing,
No.
how do you see this transformation taking place?
So as I mentioned before, fundamentally, a key aspect to moving forwards with food systems is diversity. And if we look at, you mentioned, you said the protein, and that's how it's termed. Aquatic foods is termed as fish, very few fish species. You go to Norway, it's salmon. You go to China, it's tilapia. So it's very few species, and it's not at all diverse, and it's also a concentration and intensification of production systems. But if we would go back to where I began with diversity, we should be looking at diverse systems. We should be looking at diverse geographies and taking into consideration also the values that seasonality gives us. In many parts of Africa, even in dry Africa, there are seasons of rain, and the waters are not collected and are not used. So I would say many entry points, and diversification is fundamental in systems that you use.
The questions? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I could relate with some of the key issues that you raised, because in my country, in my hometown, we have the inland water resources where we have the small fishes, and then so many years back, I get this fish from my grandma, and I'm still very fond of the memory, how sweet and delicious they were. So, but right now, my question is on governance structure. And I want to ask if you think it is important to begin to put in place some governance framework on how these aquatic resources are, one, harvested, consumed, and trade. Because the current trend now in my home country is
Which is, you should tell the
Nigeria.
Nigeria.
Nigeria. So I'm from Osun State. So
Yes.
women controls majorly the inland water in my hometown.
Mhm.
So they harvest this fish and they ship it to the city
Yes, the market.
to sell. And it's a major source of economic opportunity and resources for them. So, but I'm concerned now looking at how very important this is in the aspect of nourishing the people,
Mhm.
that these products are not usually available, even in the community that has the resources, but it's being shipped out of the community for economic reasons. So do you think that governance structure around how these resources are, one, being harvested and at the same time consumed and traded will be super helpful for achieving nourishing the community?
Oh, I have my mic, sorry. Of course, and I work a bit in Nigeria. When you would talk to the governments in the government of Nigeria, and I've just worked with them, they are looking at two fish species, catfish, tilapia, both carnivorous. And when you would ask, well, 10% of Nigeria is wetlands. What are you doing about the wetlands? What's the production system of the wetlands? It's not part of the government agenda. And when you would look at the coastal population and the inland waters, Lake Chad, then there is very, very little focus on the communities that are dependent on these water bodies for food and for their livelihoods. So again, I would say diversity is so very important, and use all the different entry points you have. If you would only look at tilapia and catfish, the first issue you have is, where do you get the feeds for these two fish species? Then you are limited in the choices you have to make a difference of what aquatic foods can do for the people of Nigeria. I've worked with students at the university, and they have cataloged all aquatic foods that are part of the systems in Nigeria. And it's extremely rich and with great diversity. So there's much more that can be used in making the systems much more whole and serving for others. When you talk about the markets, yes, I've seen that. But if you would have governments and states paying more attention to, for example, transportation of foods, improving the market systems. I go to market systems go to markets in Nigeria. Many who sell at markets are women. But if you look at the facilities women have to wash their hands, to eat their lunch, there's nothing. So there's much more that can be done from governmental level, from state level, in making sure that systems are varied and robust and serve the need of those who really are part of this.
Yeah, quick follow-up. Do you think countries and communities should begin to ban the trading and export of this food product out of the community?
I don't think that's a way to go to get results by banning. I would have liked to see that in West Africa, for example, that you do not export small fish to rich countries to be used as animal feed. But I don't think that you will get far with that. I think if you would get governments to understand the importance of aquatic foods and the diversity of aquatic foods for nourishing their people, for the effect that it can have, for example, on cognition, on school performance, on work performance, on having a healthier, well-nourished population, thereby reducing the healthcare costs. I know it's a long process, but I do think that's a much more sustainable rate for governments to go.
We're going to go to a question online, and this is coming from Ramya. And she says, thank you for your excellent talk. You talked about the shift in paradigm by saying that we should be talking about nutrition versus feeding. Could you talk more about other paradigm shifts in our relationship with food as we're thinking about food system transformation and food policies?
Yeah, well, yes. And you've heard me say it, I don't know how many times I mentioned it. For me, the greatest shift is make use of diversity of people, diversity of geographies, diversity of foods, diversity in seasonality. Look at when we talk about production systems, a lot of when we talk about staples, we never take into consideration which are the different types of traditional staples that were used and that were and that fitted into the seasonality of countries.
Question in here, in the room. I have, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Nadira, and I am from Uzbekistan. So Uzbekistan is one of only 2 double landlocked countries. So according to United Nations report, more than 40% of world population are living in seashore areas. And what about the population who are in inland territories? Could you please share some of your thoughts about how we landlocked countries can build our aquatic food systems? It's quite important for food security in our countries as well. Thank you.
Well, I've seen this in some African countries. I've also seen it in Nepal, where I have worked, which is a landlocked country. And I've seen in Africa, for one, I mean, you don't produce food here and just consume food here. One of the largest trades of food in African countries that cross borders is dried and smoked fish products. That's an important food trade. And I want to digress here. If you would go to borders where they were crossing and you look at the rules and regulations that male traders are met with and the rules and regulations that female traders are met with and the bribes that female traders must pay at borders to get their foods across compared to men. You can write a whole encyclopedia about this issue. So, but when you ask me about landlocked countries can develop inland water bodies on which they can use. I've seen this done in Nepal, I've seen this done in sub-Saharan Africa, and making use of the seasonality of waters and collecting the waters and using these for aquatic systems. I mean, many countries have been doing that for forever, but using the waters for irrigation, not using the waters for production of food.
Thank you. Eli? Next question.
Thank you so much. So we saw in the news last week about some fish die-offs in Lake Victoria and much worse fish kills in November from eutrophication and toxic algal blooms. Is diversification enough to manage these systemic threats to production, or should we be advancing other approaches as well?
I'm sure it's not the only one, and I'm sure it's not enough. By the way, in Lake Victoria, working on that issue, there's a group here at Cornell University working in Lake Victoria and has a number of PhD students working on this in this area. I think they're led by a staff, Cornell staff called Katie Forella. And they're looking at multiple ways. But one of the issues that I have heard is that the changes in how the waters are being used and for what purposes the waters are being used from Lake Victoria, and also how the lake itself is managed. So I'm sure there are multiple issues as to why these changes are happening in Lake Victoria. As you see changes in many other places, you go to China. I told about the great increase in tilapia production. There are serious issues with waters in China because of the inputs that you use for tilapia production.
Okay, we have one more question coming from the online anonymous attendee. There's several others, but we can, in the interest of time, I'll take this one. It says, hi, thank you very much for speaking to us. I have a question about sustainable practices when it comes to acquiring aquatic foods. What do you think most organizations go wrong? Why do you think most organizations go wrong, although well-intentioned?
As I said, multiple entry points. But if I would give an example, I talked about pond polyculture in Bangladesh, and that had multiple benefits. If you would use pond polyculture with indigenous fish species, and you are maintaining the natural fish species in the pond, then you aren't using pesticides to clean the pond before you stock the pond. So already there is a great benefit, and the use of pesticides to clean the ponds was the most expensive part of the production systems. And very quickly, in 5 years of work, the government of Bangladesh prohibited the use of pesticides for cleaning ponds before stocking. So there, as I said, there are many entry points that we can have. You look at wetlands in parts of Africa and Asia. You would have to make sure you maintain the integrity of wetlands and the way you use wetlands and the inputs that you put into the production systems, so that these would continue to be able to give you diversity of aquatic foods.
Thank you very much. I think that's as much time as we have for today, but if you allow me to indulge one small ritual as we thank our speaker today, we prepared a small commemorative plaque for you to take with you from the Global Development Community.
Thank you so much.
And thank you very much for your time. And students who are meeting here for lunch, we're going to walk downstairs to Man Library basement. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for coming.